Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to New America. My name is Shailen Jyotishi. I'm a managing director here, and I have the privilege of leading our program focused on science, workforce, and economic development policy called the Future of Work and Innovation Economy Initiative. And I'm delighted to be welcoming you all to today's webinar, which is being hosted by the initiative, called How Indirect Cost Reform Will Affect University Industry R&D Partnerships. Throughout World War II, public-private R&D partnerships supported by federal investments powered America's rise as a global leader in scientific and technological innovation over the 20th century. These investments and the partnerships they enabled led to the meteoric rise of the American economy, making the United States home to Silicon Valley, the birth of the internet, and the birthplace of everyday technologies, from GPS technology to the PageRank algorithm that underpins search engines like Google. After all, around one-third of all US patents stem from government-funded research, a share that has been increasing steadily since the 1970s. Even today's AI zeitgeist traces its early funding from the US government in the 1960s and over the course of so-called AI winters. And central to the history of that public-private innovation partnership in America are the nuances that go into the financial models that underpin our R&D enterprise. These nuances may seem esoteric and trite, but they're critically important. In particular, the world of indirect costs, often referred to as facilities and administrative costs, are complex and poorly understood. Indirect costs include organizational expenses that are needed for operations, but are not tied to a particular research project or grant. And this year, indirect cost structures are changing, and they will have some serious ramifications on university R&D partnerships with industry. In the past several months, the Trump administration has proposed sweeping indirect cost caps at agencies spanning the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the Departments of Energy and Defense. These changes have sparked a great deal of debate of the futures that the nation's research universities, our innovation capacity, and our ability to foster the same sort of emerging technology leadership that drove America's 20th century rise. Indirect cost reform directly implicates other science and tech policy initiatives sought by the administration and Congress. Around this time last Monday, we hosted a bipartisan dialogue on the National Science Foundation's Regional Innovation Engines program. It's just one example. The NSF Engines is the broadest investment in place-based tech developments in the modern era, created by Congress several years ago. They provide up to 10 years of funding to regional teams of universities, industry, but also national labs and economic developers and states, all to spark economic growth in industries rooted in emerging technologies through a combination of public-private partnerships. Programs like Engines have attracted interest across the political spectrum for their potential for catalyzing these kinds of partnerships. But they're a good example of the kinds of programs that will be impacted by indirect cost reform. That's why today we're really pleased to have an expert panel to help shed some insights on these reforms and proposals for forming indirect costs in a way that support these university industry R&D partnerships. I'll briefly introduce our speakers and then turn the floor to them for the remainder of the discussion. First up, I'd like to invite on the virtual stage our moderator, Aaron Shoemaker, who is a reporter at Politico. Aaron has done a lot of great coverage on the conversation of indirect costs and even beyond that. So we're delighted to have you with us, Aaron. Joining Aaron is Kelvin Droegmeier, who's the former director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the past Oklahoma Secretary of Science and Technology, and a forefront strategist around the indirect cost conversation. Joining Dr. Droegmeier is Dr. Franz Cordova, president of the Science Philanthropy Alliance and former director of the National Science Foundation. And joining Dr. Cordova is Dr. Anthony Boconfuso, president and CEO of UIDP, which is an organization bringing together universities and industries for the very partnerships that we described. And last but not least, we have Elizabeth Bruce, who's the director and strategy lead for innovation and the society at Microsoft. These discussions that we'll have today will not just be relevant for university leaders, but also those from industry, from philanthropy, from tech-based economic development, and all across the political spectrum. That's why I'm delighted we can have this forum today. Kelvin, France, Tony, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining. Aaron, thank you for moderating. And with that, I'll hand things off over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Shaylin. Let's get right into it. Kelvin, I would love to kick off today's discussion with you. You spearheaded work on developing a new model for indirect costs called the FAIR model. And there are a lot of misconceptions, I think, about what indirect costs, Shaylin mentioned them, also called facilities and administrative costs, F&A costs, what they are. I've heard some people incorrectly call F&A costs a tip universities get on top of their grants. What's a simple way for people, our audience, my readers, to understand F&A costs?
Thank you, Aaron. It's a really great question. And the words direct and indirect costs are sort of meaningless to anyone outside of our own domain here. So I kind of like to think of it in an analogous way to being in a restaurant. The direct cost at a restaurant that you would bear if you go have a meal would be the actual cost, say, of a hamburger, of French fries, of a drink, maybe a salad or something like that. What it actually costs to buy those items. Then on top of that, to prepare the meal, you have to have things like a stove, you have to have wait staff, you have to have a credit card system. You're probably paying rent on the building, there's electricity charges and things like that. And so some of those things, like for example, if you order a hamburger, there's a particular cost that could be related directly to you in addition to the cost of the actual food. But then there are costs that, for example, like electricity, that everybody pays for. So think of direct and indirect costs as the things that you actually pay for in your meal, but then all the associated costs that are needed to prepare the meal and give it to you as a patron. And the important point is that they're not separable. You can't say, well, let's fund this amount of direct costs and this amount of indirect costs. You can have all the hamburger you want, but if you don't have a stove to prepare the meal, you don't get a meal, right? So it's very much the same as in terms of research. In research, the so-called direct costs are those associated directly and attributable to a particular project. Salaries of investigators, salaries of graduate students, travel, maybe some equipment, things like that. The support costs that go along that are absolutely essential for the performance of that research and can't be disentangled from it are things like facilities, administrative reporting, required compliance requirements that the federal government promulgates, which are absolutely essential to doing research. And all of those things can be attributable directly to a project. And so in the FAIR model, we changed the name of these things to make it much more clear, but we also restructured the entire system to where it's much more transparent, much more accountable. And the bottom line thing to remember about the FAIR model, if you don't remember anything else, is that it makes all of these costs very explicit, very direct to where you can actually see them in a grant proposal or see them on your restaurant tab. So you know exactly what you're paying for, both the direct costs and the indirect costs. And that makes it possible to have the conversation, well, what should the government be paying for? What should the institution maybe be paying for? What should other partners like the private sector be paying for? This model, because it's so transparent, puts everything all on the table explicitly, enables that conversation. Right now, it's a very difficult thing to do with the F&A model because everything in F&A or indirect costs is charged as a percentage. It's hard to tease out, well, where's the money actually going? And that, of course, is of great interest to Congress and taxpayers, and understandably so. So we're trying to make sure that it's very clear what these actual costs are to perform research, but also to support the performance of the research. So there's the two different categories.
So we've got these working definitions of some key terms that I think will help everyone to understand the FAIR model. Can you sort of lay out in lay people's terms how this model, which I think is really more than one pathway, works?
Yes, right. So there's actually two options in the model, and the best way to think of it is one option is sort of like your itemized tax return, where say, okay, I have this many graduate students, postdocs working on the project. Those are my direct costs. I have equipment that I'm going to be using or buying, laptop computers. I've got some travel to conferences and so on. And then underneath that is what facility am I actually going to be using? I'm doing human subject research, so I have specific compliance requirements that are associated with my given project. We call those essential research performance services and those costs that support the research. So we break it into those two buckets, and again, they're really inseparable. And so institutions will have what we're proposing is 2 years from the time that the model would be approved to actually prepare for this, because it will take some preparation. But all of what the institutions need to do this more detailed costing of space and facilities and administrative activities associated with the grant, they already have that information from F&A rate proposals that they do every few years already. So the information is there. We just have to prepare the structure, and that's why we're saying 2 years. We also want 2 years to finalize some of the finer points of the model with the community. Now, if it turns out that that detailed accounting is not something you as an institution can do because maybe you don't have the administrative resources, you're a HBCU, minority serving institution, emerging research institution, just like in the restaurant example, you could actually then say, well, I want to take a different option here. And that option basically aggregates a few of the costs, especially facilities, into a fixed percentage of the budget. It's still auditable, but it makes it much more simple for these smaller institutions that maybe aren't doing the really complex and expensive research. It makes it much easier for them to implement the FAIR model. And again, it's still accountable and so on. So the important thing about the FAIR model is whether you're doing the itemized deduction or the easy form, the standard deduction, or you're doing the detailed FAIR model, or by analogy, the simple model, it spans all of the types of research institutions we have, from the very large hospitals, independent research institutes, all the way to the more small institutions, say, for example, primarily undergraduate institutions, because we want everyone to participate in the research enterprise. That's basically how the FAIR model works. Think of it as an itemized version of your taxes, the simple version of your taxes. You pick which one is appropriate for you, which is exactly what an institution would do in selecting which option of the model they want to use.
Yeah, I like that tax return comparison. In terms of why this model came about in the first place, you spoke a little bit to transparency, but why does the current model need reform? Like what were some of the problems
Right.
with it that you can lay out for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, this whole framework of indirect and direct costs, that bifurcated structure, actually arose right after World War II. And only a year later, in 1946, there were questions starting to be raised. And so Congress got involved in 1958. And basically, ever since then, there have been lots of questions asked about this particular model. And so the F&A structure that we have in place right now, facilities administrative structure, has actually served us quite well. But there are some issues associated with it that make it difficult to explain, difficult to understand. Some see it as not being, completely transparent and so on. And back in 2017, there was a proposed 10% cap of the F&A rate at the National Institutes of Health. And at that point, some language got put in the Labor H bill that basically prohibited any caps. And that language has survived until March of this year, when it expired. And so the real question then became, well, okay, can we just keep on using this model and explaining it? And the answer was no. When we started talking with members of Congress and the caps got put in place, or proposed anyway, for NIH and then ultimately NSF, DOE, and DOD, that became a forcing function. And the wording from Congress, the message from Congress was, the current F&A model is on its way out. Get used to it. There's going to be change. And so as the research community, we said, we really ought to take this opportunity to address some of the long-standing challenges that even our own faculty have with the F&A model, and come together as a community, working with government, working with the White House, working with Congress, to put something in place that will be durable, that will last, that makes a lot of sense. It's much more accountable and transparent to the taxpayers. And most importantly, this is really critical, will ensure American leadership globally in science and innovation and research. That's really our top line goal. And we came up with a FAIR model as an effort with the entire community. It was done rather quickly because of the timing of congressional planning for the 26 budget. And I'm pleased to say that there was another group, a very, very, very good group here in the United States and in academia, completely independently pursued their own version of a new model, and it turns out it's almost exactly the same as what we came up with. So it warmed my heart to think that we weren't out in left field somewhere, that this model we've landed on, though it's not perfect, certainly it is, we think, a good model that will address all the concerns that Congress has, one of which is about how the reimbursed funds are spent. That's another issue. It's kind of an esoteric issue, but when research happens, the institutions like a university actually pay for the indirect costs, and they're reimbursed by the government for those. And since it's a reimbursement and you've already paid the costs up front, that money is very, very discretionary. You could use it for whatever you want. But some folks in Congress look at this and say, well, it's being used for startup and possibly for other things, who knows what. We fixed that problem. We structured the FAIR model to where that reimbursement comes back into very specific allocable categories from which the money was drawn. And so that makes it, again, much more transparent. And that's been a bugaboo with Congress for years and years and years. And we finally fixed that. So it wasn't that the FNA model was some miserable failure, but it did have limitations. And so the proposed caps basically were a call to have the community come together and put forward something to the government as a proposal that we feel would be the best for the American research enterprise.
So we've talked a little bit about, how universities fit in there, and how this affects their future. I'm going to broaden this out, and bring some other folks in here. But before I do that, I want to get your take. Beyond universities, what could this mean for the research and development partnerships that universities have with industry?
Right. So just to be clear, that we developed this model for academic institutions. We developed for independent research institutes and medical centers and hospitals funded by the federal government for research that fall under something called the Uniform Guidance. 2 CFR 200 is how it's implemented. It is not for DOE, federal laboratory or national laboratories. It's not for private companies. It's not for private foundations of the type that France represents. It's really for the ones I just mentioned. That said, we feel that this model will be really helpful to our engagements with private companies because private companies, private sector lives in a very different world, and appropriately so, than say, for example, universities do. And so when you negotiate a research agreement with a private company, sometimes this notion of indirect costs and F&A gets confusing because they have something called overhead, which is actually quite different than what indirect costs are in the university sense. And so they also have something called G&A, which is very different than F&A. And they also have profit and fees and things like that. So the two different worlds sometimes can collide when they're trying to collaborate. And I think this model will make a whole lot more sense to industry to be clear on what their dollars are actually funding, just like the government. And it should really enable, I think, much more effective partnerships and quicker negotiations, which sometimes can get pretty drawn out for a lot of reasons that Tony, I'm sure, will talk about. So I do think this will empower greater degrees of engagement with private sector.
France, I'm going to turn to you. You bring several interesting perspectives to this discussion. You directed the National Science Foundation, which is one of the agencies that would be affected if the Trump administration's 15% flat cap were to become a reality. You also served as a university president. Now you lead the Science Philanthropy Alliance. So a few different perspectives you're bringing here. I'm curious sort of what you think about Kelvin's perspective. But before I get to that, I'm curious about who should be paying here. Could philanthropy help step up here and pay for some of the indirect costs that fuel basic research? That's sort of the foundation of research and development.
Sure. Thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. And I want to mention that philanthropy has been a part of devising the model that Kelvin was talking about. So, and we've followed this very closely. Philanthropy does pay for some indirect costs for the research awards that it funds, okay? The average is about 10 to 15%, but some philanthropies are as high as 20%, and at least one prominent foundation is almost 30%. So they do pay for some indirect costs, but a noteworthy difference between philanthropies and the federal government is that philanthropies include some expenses as direct costs that the government counts those same expenses as indirect costs. So that really means that the effective amount that they're paying is much more, can be much more than the 15% or 20% or so that is on the books. Examples of costs that the federal government would say are indirect, but philanthropy would count as direct, are software, databases, cloud storage, and project-specific administration.
Okay, that is helpful insight. In terms of straight up replacing government funding, though, is that a place that philanthropy could step in and take over those costs entirely?
No. I mean, first of all, there's not enough money, but the main thing is why would philanthropy do that? Every philanthropist and every philanthropic foundation was funded based on a specific goal or vision. The leadership of those organizations, if say the founder, the one who actually gave the money for the philanthropy in the first place, if they've passed on that their leadership, including their boards, their CEOs, they abide by the founding principles and their program officers pursue that vision. Some philanthropies are place-based, some are disease-oriented, some want to push back on environmental degradation of the planet, and some want to fund early-stage scholars. So they all have their particular things that they are really committed to. And that's why they set up the foundation or the philanthropy organization in the first place. So the important thing to realize is philanthropy is constituted differently than the federal government and differently than industry. Each sector has its own genetic makeup, and each of them is vital to what has been a thriving research system for the US.
Got it. And so you've got these different perspectives. I feel secure in asking you this question since you've got insight into a few different worlds. Who should be paying for these costs? Are there other groups or sectors that should be stepping up a little more than they are?
Well, this is how I feel about it, that each sector that values basic and applied research and how it has made this a great country should understand the importance of all the costs, the total costs. And you can call it what you will. You can call it direct, indirect. We have some other names in the FAIR model that Kelvin described for it. Each sector should qualify what should be direct and indirect depending on where they're coming from. And they have been doing this. But the important thing is they should pay for all the costs associated with the research that they sponsor. It's not reasonable to expect universities to pay for indirect costs, although that, frankly, is what all sectors, including the federal government and philanthropy, have been doing for a long time. Even though the numbers are on the books are much higher for the indirect charges or costs that are paid by the government, say 50%, even 70% or so, those don't completely pay. And I know from being a president of two universities that we always had to cough up quite a bit more money in order to pay for all of the research costs. So I think if nothing else, all of this has really brought all sectors to consider, oh yes, there's much more clarity, and Kelvin and the whole group, including philanthropists that are participating in it, have now just shown a big spotlight on what research really costs. And I think all sectors should step up to paying in their own way for the total costs of research.
Tony, I want to bring you in here. You lead an organization that brings together universities and industry to team up on R&D. What do you think about the picture that Kelvin painted at the onset here about how this could be a good thing for industry? You can see where the money's going.
Sure. And so, I just came from our conference in Chicago last week where we had 400 people gathering talking about university industry collaborations. And, costing on projects is one aspect of a relationship that I think we should keep in mind, that there can be a lot of other factors that come into play. So, great research universities have strategic partners that think about things like recruitment, sponsored research, access to facilities, partnering in other ways. And so, this is just one aspect of an overall mosaic, and I think that's important to point out. I also think it's important to note that not all companies are the same. And so within large multinational companies, you'll have variance, but then obviously startups will have a different perspective on these issues. Now, that all being said, as it relates to industry-sponsored research, where you typically find indirect costs being charged to a sponsor, if it's a company, um, they have a variety of ways of looking at it. Some companies will pay what the federal government rate is on a proposal, and they do that willingly. Some universities, a small number of universities, actually charge their not their negotiated cap rate, but their actual rate. And so I don't think this has been brought up yet, but on the federally negotiated rate since the late 80s or the early 90s, there's been a cap on administrative costs at 26%. So even if your calculation was at 33%, you could only get reimbursed from the federal government at 26%. And so there are some universities that have calculated the rates above 26%, and on industry-sponsored projects, the rates are actually at the full rate of 33% for that component of the F&A rate. There are other companies that look at the rate, and if it's on a budget explicitly shown, they'll push back, especially onto those universities that have rates at a higher level. So there are, as you know, universities that are at a de minimis rate of 10%. They accept that, or they'll have a rate that's in the 20s or 30s. But then the large research universities are typically above 50%, and some even higher than that, right? In the 60s, for example. And so some companies will look at that. I think what is also important to keep in mind, at the end of the day, regardless of what the rate is, it's a cost value proposition. And so large multinational companies will look at a proposal. Perhaps they have a standing program like a federal agency where they ask for proposals from around the world, from great universities. They get those proposals in, and they'll look at what the proposed budgets are and then have to make a decision. Are we going to get good value for the cost of this project? Just like you do with your cars, right? You decide, is this car a good value or is this car better value? The one that costs more may be actually a better value than a less expensive car. And so you may find a company willing to pay higher rates, not just for indirect, but for direct costs, because there are other factors that go into play. They want to work with a specific faculty member, a specific university. They feel like there's been other factors that have come into play that they get more ROI. But at the end of the day, it's about, to me, when I think about companies engaging universities, it's, am I going to get the perceived value for the cost of this project, more so than what the rate is? And of course, I'm generalizing because once again, there are companies that will look at rates. And so there will be a factor here, but I can tell you, I have not had a single company come to me or a company representative come to me and say, oh, well, the federal government's looking to change indirect cost rates. That's an opportunity for us to reduce our indirect cost rate that we pay for on industry-sponsored research projects. Not a single one.
That's interesting. From the outside, the current model, at least to me, seems like a pretty decent deal for the private sector. You've got the government funding a lot of basic research, and then private industry can innovate and build technologies off of that foundation. Would changing the current model upset that dynamic in any way?
Yeah, so, I think it's important to keep in mind, federal agencies like the National Science Foundation or the NIH. So there's, mission, and then there's the NSF, which is not a mission agency. They have traditionally funded good science and engineering projects. And so things get a score and they get funded. Companies have a different perspective. They're not necessarily looking to fund, quote unquote, the best science. They look for things that are going to help them achieve their business goals. And that's a separate question. And so there may be a whole host of other factors that come into play that affect their decision making on whether or not to fund a project. And so, I think the changes, we don't know where the changes how the changes in indirect costs will potentially affect industry sponsored activities at universities. But I think the real issue for universities should be to look at how they can increase the ROI for companies that they want to engage, because companies can fund universities in the US, they can fund universities globally, they can do for internal research, they can use those funds to fund national labs or other research organizations. And so it's really a question of, does this make sense for us to fund as compared to these other aspects? And as I think most of the people on this call know, very little funding from companies is spent externally as a percent of their overall R&D budgets. It's a very small percentage. And so if you want to increase that, and I'm asked that all the time, how do you increase funding to universities from companies? You're going to have to increase the ROI for that. It's a market-driven approach.
So I want to bring in Elizabeth here. We're talking about industry. You certainly know about that. Microsoft is a powerhouse when it comes to developing some of these new technologies. In terms of that kind of development, what's a Microsoft product or innovation that might not have been possible without facilities and administrative funding? Draw a little line for us from this conversation to the real world.
Thanks, Erin. And I agree with many of the things that have been said. Kelvin, Tony had a lot of great points about how the way industry thinks about funding R&D at universities is different than the way government thinks about the investment in R&D at universities. So I think those are really important points. But coming back to like innovation and the value of university research. So, I mean, just looking at the value, both direct and indirect funding goes towards federally funded research has really been transformative, and computer science in particular. We're looking at an incredible time right now in that big tech sector around AI, for example. And a lot of the frontier models that have been developed and are powering today's AI products and services come from algorithms developed in universities, natural language processing algorithms, computer vision algorithms. They were all enabled and developed by federal funding in universities going back to the 50s. Internet search is another great one. The fact that we have algorithms that have powered our search engines and made them so incredibly fast. Those were technologies originally developed in universities. The internet, cybersecurity, encryption, a lot of those fundamental technologies were also developed in university research labs.
Those are some good examples. I also want to hear your take on the question that I asked France. Could industry, step up and be paying more here for some of these R&D partnerships? Like, where do you think the line should sort of be drawn in terms of who should be paying what?
So I just want to start by saying I think university industry partnerships are incredibly important. And I want to say that they are very important right now, in particular because industry is moving very fast when it comes to technologies like AI. And it's both the development of AI and also the use of AI to advance science. Something that is specifically called out in the AI action plan and a priority in terms of research for this country. So it is really important that we enable universities to work closely with industry and vice versa. When we think about funding university research, it's funding indirect and direct. We pay indirect costs on our sponsored research agreements with universities. So I don't think industry thinks of it like separately. I think that we think of it as supporting research at universities. And I think that's the big question, is how do we ensure that we are maintaining the research investment in basic research, and that we're ensuring that we're going to continue to be global leaders as a country in science and technology. I think that's what's really important.
Interesting. That makes me think too. I mean, I cover the NIH at Politico, and universities have been so outspoken about what a cap on indirect costs would mean for them. They've, joined lawsuits and lobbied Congress, said that such a cap would decimate the U.S. research enterprise. Like, I'm seeing a lot of this through a university lens. Is there anything you could tell us about what's happening inside industry? Just give us a little bit of a temperature read there, what the tenor is inside industry. How are industry leaders viewing this? It's not a perspective I've heard as much about.
Yeah, I think kind of goes back to what Tony was saying around how industry views the university partnerships. And like he said, we tend to think a little more short term, and we are very commercially driven, right? So our investments are going to look at what is the return on investment, what are the areas we're investing in that are relevant to our commercial priorities, and those change over time. So from our perspective, we're going to be, continuing to invest in university research. We continue to think it's absolutely critical. But the investment that federal government makes is very different than the way right now industry thinks about its investment in university research, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. Does it mean that heads are a little cooler, that people aren't freaking out? Like in a practical sense, does it, inside of a meeting, is it a little bit calmer?
Well, like Calvin was saying, the FAIR model and the proposal for FAIR is impacting federal government's research agreements with academic and research institutions. And so the fact is, like Tony said, when industry is thinking about university agreements, I think we agree that increased transparency is really important. I think a huge important factor if we want to increase industry university partnerships is lowering barriers to doing those partnerships. So the idea of streamlining, making it more transparent, making it more fair, I think industry will be very supportive of those things, because you don't want to industry is moving so fast, you don't want to take months, sometimes years, to negotiate a sponsored research agreement. We want it to be like, let's hit the ground running and let's start working together yesterday.
I see you nodding, Tony. Do you have anything to add there?
No, I mean, Elizabeth is spot on. Many companies are expressing an interest and a desire to do more with industry. And I talk often about what it means to be an industry engaged university. And there are things that you can do if you want to have more industry partnerships and more industry relationships. And so, just like if you want to lose weight or if you want to learn a language, there are things that you have to do. Buying Duolingo does not mean that you will learn Spanish. You actually have to put time and energy into doing it to make that happen. If you want to lose weight, you change your diet, you work out more, you do other things. If you're a university and you want to do more with industry, that requires you to be thoughtful in doing that. It's not manna from heaven. It requires thoughtfulness. So, contracting time, which is a big issue for UIDP. In fact, that's how we got our start 20 years ago. It's because companies plotted how long it took them to get sponsored research agreements into place with universities. And so you can be very thoughtful in how you go about your business. And so, if I was in a room with 100 university presidents and I said, how many of you would like to do more with industry? 100 hands would go up. But then when you ask specific things about it, for example, will you provide credit for faculty members in promotion and tenure for industry-sponsored research agreements? Maybe that's even applied. How many of you are willing to do that? Some hands will go up, some hands will come down. If you ask them, will they rent space on their campuses to companies who want to co-locate? Some will say yes, some will say no. Changing intellectual property models for accessing foreground intellectual property. There are a number of universities that provide that, some don't. And so if you want to do more with industry, there are lots and lots of approaches and tactics that you can use, but the leadership of the institution is really important in helping set the tone. And so, France was at Purdue. Purdue has tremendous industry engagement for a university. It's not in Cambridge, right? It's not in the Bay. It's in West Lafayette, which is a lovely town, but it's not in a core place where there's tons of companies located. But yet companies go to Purdue to do work there because of the faculty, the quality of the people, but also because of the culture that exists at Purdue. And so, and they're not alone. There are lots of universities that have an industry engaged mentality. And so I think that's really, really important for universities who are looking to do more with companies, not to replace the federal government, because they're not. The companies are not going to replace federal funding for R&D. But if universities wish to do more with industry as just a separate goal, then it's going to require intentionality. And I think that's what's really, really important. And it's what, we think about every day in our organization.
Thank you. And as we know, none of this is happening inside a vacuum. There are politics afoot here. Kelvin, in addition to working with the universities and the research groups, I know you've been fine-tuning the FAIR model with Congress and with the White House Office of Management and Budget. Tell us where those talks stand right now. Bring us up to speed, please.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. If I could, before I do, let me just make if I could, a couple of quick reflections on what this great discussion. First, to Francis' point, research is a loss leader at our universities. It costs us usually 20 to 30 cents to bring in a federal dollar. And you might wonder, if you're in the private sector, why in the world would you do that? And the reason we do it is because that we want to continue innovating, making new discoveries, because we understand that and also training the workforce and educating the workforce of the future is absolutely crucial to the future of our country. And that's why we do it. It's baked into the DNA of what universities and colleges do. The other point I wanted to make was, you think about research and also education, but research in particular is both a public good and a private good. And unfortunately, we've kind of lost the whole public good notion of this. So if you kind of look at maybe a narrative that says, look, we've got multi-trillion-dollar companies right now. Private sector funds about 3/4 or more of the research that's done in this country of R&D. They also perform about 75 to 80% of the R&D that's done. And as Tony said, about 1% of all their R&D money goes externally to the companies. That's very much a private good. And you could say, well, gee, boy, why aren't they paying more for this? Because they're huge beneficiaries of the federal investment. And in fact, that's what exactly happened after World War II, very intentionally so, that now our private sector has grown to be so robust because they do leverage the federal investments. Because as we've heard, the private sector has no real incentive to invest in discovery, curiosity-driven research in universities unless it is directly, specifically related to their line of business. And typically that actually happens internally. So should they put more skin in the game? Should they fund more of this sort of thing? They already do. When these companies pay their taxes and they grow the economy and they build wealth and they create jobs, that money goes into the federal coffers. So that's one way that this investment that the government makes is returned to the government with a huge ROI of building a resilient country with the lead innovation in the world. Where did ChatGPT come from? Where did the internet come from? Where did Google come from? All the way up and down the line, it's called the United States. We don't see other countries innovating like we are, but they are on our heels big time. Well, that's the private good. Well, what's the public good? There is a public good for research, and that is the federal investment that I just talked about. And Ronald Reagan laid this out beautifully in a short speech he made about the fundamental role of federal government to fund basic curiosity-driven research, because it's the starting point in a lot of ways. We've kind of lost that public good. If it doesn't cure cancer tomorrow, if it doesn't lead to a new company, a startup, or whatever, we shouldn't be doing it. That's not true. Rick Rashid, who was president of Microsoft Research when I was on their board, he said something I'll never forget. He said, we do curiosity-driven research because we never know when we're going to need to pull something out of our hat here and use it to address a crisis or something. And the pandemic was a great example. So I just want to say, I think this public-private good is very important. Yes, we want more engagement with industry because in the last 30 plus years, as a percentage, the amount of money coming to universities as part of their overall funding, external funding, that part from private sector as a percentage has been flat for roughly 30 plus years. What that says to me is that somehow we're not structured to where private sector is leveraging the tremendous assets that we have in our academic enterprise. And it's funny to me, I've been in this game 40 years. These same conversations have happened year after year after year. We need a forcing function to drive change. That's what happened to FNA, and I think it's kind of what's happening here. So hopefully with the innovation capacity that we have, we will be able to 10 years from now say, you know what, we stopped having that same conversation over and over again. We actually made some structural changes that massively improve the public-private partnerships with industry and academia. So to your question, Aaron, we have worked closely with the Congress and OMB pretty much from the beginning. As I said, Congress kind of told us what the issues were, the fact that the FNA model as we know it today is on its way out. And so we started working with them on, okay, here's the process we're using. We kept them briefed and so on. And when we had the contours of a model sufficiently developed when we started then talking with OMB, because we knew OMB was interested in putting out a new model, which they are going to do in the next few weeks. We've had very productive conversations with them in good faith. We're not on the same page, and they have some different philosophies, but I think what they're going to do and what we have done share some important characteristics. But I think one of the most important things that has happened in this whole process is education. I think OMB's eyes have been open about certain things. I think my eyes and other people's eyes have been open. We had, as France said, folks from private philanthropy on the team that developed the model. We didn't know exactly the world they lived in. They really educated us. So I think this was maybe the canonical example of folks from all different areas, different persuasions, different sectors coming together to say, what's best for America? And how can we make sure that we are completely transparent and open to taxpayers who we depend on in the social compact to fund our research, to do the discovery research at universities, but then also to engage with the private sector to do more and to have a robust enterprise that has developed over the last 80 years. The next 80 years, we ought to go forward in very dramatic ways. Now is not the time to be pulling back because the geopolitical context is such that if we do that, it will be to our own peril. So I think we all have the same goal. Some of us are coming about it in a slightly different way, but the talks have been productive. I think the education has been good, and we'll see where it all lands. But I'm still enthusiastic about the future of our country.
Yeah, we'll be watching closely, and our audience has some questions which I'd love to get to now, and some of them are about these OMB talks. And so one question we have from the audience is, has OMB commented on the model, including its complexity?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. In fact, they've given us their thoughts, and as we develop the final version, which we call the FAIR model, absolutely, yeah. And we think that it's extremely transparent, it's extremely accountable. And I think when we first started talking to them, it's like, wow, we're not too far apart on this. And so I don't know exactly what their new model is going to look like, but certainly we have an opportunity to make comparisons and continue the conversation, which I think is very, very healthy. So yeah, they did comment on the model, and it was very helpful to us, I think, to see things that perhaps we hadn't seen. And of course, they're coming at it from a more of a political perspective. We were not politically naive about all this, but we also felt that we wanted to create a model that, as I say, had the attributes of transparency and accountability and funded the actual costs of research. And then it's really up to Congress and the White House to determine, okay, who pays for what and in what proportion. And I think France said this, and Tony as well. When the government comes in and funds research at a university, they're leveraging stuff we already have. You look around our campuses, oh my goodness, we've got all this stuff. And on one extreme, you'd say, well, does it make sense for them to just come in and use that stuff for free? And you'd say, that didn't make a whole lot of sense. They ought to pay for something, right? I mean, we're building the buildings, we're building the facilities, we got staff, HR people who do our payroll. They're coming in and leveraging that for just the incremental cost of using those folks. So somewhere between nothing and the full cost is where we should land. And certainly we want to have skin in the game too, but we already have a lot of skin in the game. $7 billion every year of unrecovered indirect costs from NSF data, and that's a pretty big chunk of change.
You spoke to this a little bit. You said that OMB should have, I think, a model coming in coming weeks, but just to put a pin on it, another question from the audience is there an update on timing of decision making on indirect cost changes? That would be helpful, they say.
That's a question we ask ourselves all the time. So we're trying to get something in law in the 26 appropriation, the FAIR model in law. And I think from my understanding and talking with OMB, they're going to undertake a rulemaking process, which is what they do. And there'll be a comment period for public comment and things like that. And so the timing of it is uncertain. Proposing a CR, continuing resolution through November 20th. That carries certain ramifications for both us and OMB, and then we'll see what happens after that. So you kind of just wait to the next hour to know what's going to happen in Washington. Things change pretty quickly, but we don't really know. But hopefully something in the 26 budget, be it a continuing resolution, some type of a minibus, an omnibus, or things like that. We strategized all those things out.
Got it. I'm gonna put this question to you, France. But if someone else would like to jump in as well, please feel free. And the question is, indirect cost is one headwind, but also 8% endowment tax, decreased science spending, and the impact of H-1B tax. What is the net effect on science?
It's pretty bad. I'm counsel to a couple of big research universities and have seen the numbers under different scenarios of what has already happened and what could happen in future in Congress. I think that all of this kind of signals the breakup in some sense of an amazing partnership between government and universities that has been the envy of the world, and that goes back, 80 years to the enormous achievements of people helping the government win in the Second World War. For universities, I've seen the data that this move, if the original OMB proposal is made, will lead to reductions in staff, reductions in faculty, and something we haven't really focused on in this conversation, a reduction in the students, the graduate students, the postdocs, who are the whole talent pipeline that industry relies on. They hire those, and then they train them to do their special work. But without a talent pipeline that's really robust, we have a tremendous amount of threat from the rest of the world, who has benefited from us by sending their students for decades to us to be educated, and now they're running institutions, universities, and the NASAs of other countries and so on. And they are really funding the talent pipeline, and they're attracting them. We have people in our country now that are leaving to take posts, and I've seen this personally in other countries. So there's a real threat to our global competitiveness with all this, and that partnership has just been very precious, and we're about to be out competed, and I see it already happening.
This is a bit of a related question, I think, which could be for you, France, or perhaps you, Kelvin. And that's, how will changes in indirect cost reimbursement affect construction of new labs and incubators at universities? Will we see an effect there?
Well, think you'll see an effect, yes, in all of that infrastructure. Philanthropists have notably, some very wealthy philanthropists stepped up and funded some very important research centers at our universities and at private research institutions. And those have been absolutely tremendous, but they have to be continually fed. You need to upgrade equipment. You need to be hiring the faculty that are going to teach the students and giving the student fellowships to utilize that infrastructure. So yes, infrastructure is a concern, and there can be initial gifts that would help build something, but the building has to have heat and electricity and people and staff and all the rest of it. So it's just a very complex engine that needs to be continually fed. And I just want to make one other comment, going back to Kelvin's very astute remark about the difference between private good and public good. So many of the things that I saw when I was director of NSF, the discovery of gravitational waves, and the image of a black hole. These are the kinds of discoveries that were on the front page of newspapers, not only in our country, but we actually have a huge poster of every country in the world had those things on the front page above the fold. And those are public good type of discoveries. And there are many, many more we could mention. In fact, all the antecedents of AI and so forth were all public good discoveries before industry found them and found how to utilize them well. And so that's what's at real danger. It may not be the businesses right today. I mean, we could coast for another, few years or so, but it's the businesses of tomorrow. Where are those going to come from if we're not feeding the talent pipeline at our nation's universities?
And if I could just follow on to France's excellent answer there is a mistaken impression that universities just go chase research dollars to build buildings. We own the risk on those buildings. If we can't fill them with researchers who are productively doing great work and getting grants and so on, the government doesn't own the risk. We own the debt service on those buildings, and we have to pay for it. So there's a lot of very careful strategic planning that goes on at institutions, just like that France was at Purdue and UC Riverside, right? UC Riverside. And they plan extremely carefully and thoughtfully because, like I said, research is a lost leader. So you've got to convince a lot of people to go build a new building that is is going to focus on research. But this notion of chasing dollars to go build buildings is not true. That's not how it works. And so I just wanted to mention that because this notion of facilities and buildings and the private sector should come and fund them. That's just not in the cards, as Tony and Elizabeth mentioned.
Here's a question for Elizabeth and Tony, perhaps, from the audience. For life science tools companies, should they be expected to have long-term contracts where capital equipment will be shared or rented out by larger universities?
Well, can I just jump in? I want to just follow on what was just Calvin and Prince just said around this this model that has worked so well in the United States for the last 75 years, where it has benefited both public and private sector, I think is 100% true. And it is that basic curiosity-driven research at universities that leads to the breakthroughs that, like you're saying, it's not just going to make AI a little bit better today. It's going to really be the thing after AI. Like, what's next? What is the disruptive technology beyond fusion and quantum? We've got to be investing now for the breakthroughs that are going to happen in the future and sustain the whole country. And I think that model has worked so well. And it's like France was saying, it's like other countries have come to the United States to understand how our model works and to replicate it in their countries. So that is really like the engine of innovation. So in terms of like life sciences, companies, I think it kind of goes to like the fact that a lot of research needs resources, kind of infrastructure to do that research. And those are resources that need to be maintained, and the investment and funding for those need to be sustained over the long term. So it may be that, there may need to be more coalitions or consortium that get together and bring, say philanthropic and industry funding together to support some of the infrastructure and resources needed to do research. So that a university has that commitment in terms of the ability to sustain research over the long term. Tony, I turn it over to you for your opinion too.
Yeah, so I don't know that I want to add too much to that other than maybe a complementary thing, which I think is important, which we haven't said. And that is, there's been a report recently put out by the National Academies on reducing regulatory burden. So there's a huge need to not just focus on reimbursing the current cost structure related to facilities and administrative, but the regulatory burden that universities face for managing research is grown significantly. And so there are a couple of ways to look at this. And I know many universities are talking about this. I know France and Kelvin and I have talked about this, the need to find ways to reduce the expenditures that universities have to spend to maintain the research enterprise. And there are also some simple things the federal government can do. And I'll just give you one example. There's a fairly arcane IRS Rev Proc called 2007-47, which affects universities' ability to provide foreground intellectual property and sponsored research agreements to companies without affecting potentially their tax-exempt status. And so, this is the kind of thing, it has very little impact on the federal treasury. The budget impact would be very modest. And yet it goes to what Elizabeth was talking about before, which is affecting the ability of universities and companies to get to an agreement quickly. And so just a simple change to the IRS Rev Proc 2007-47 would potentially have dramatic impact on the ability of companies and universities to work in a much more facile manner. So things like that, along with things like reducing the regulatory burden in managing R&D, could also affect dramatically the ability of universities to conduct research from a financial perspective. And so I don't think we should lose sight of these things as well. So it's a mosaic of issues. all of us unanimously agree that the American R&D enterprise is a jewel of the world, and it's an envy of the world. All of us have an ability to work globally. Other countries look to us as a leader in this area. There are a lot of things that we can do. So it's not just one simple bullet. There are lots of things that need to be done, and we need to be thoughtful in having a sense of urgency to maintain and grow the stature. It's a national security issue. It's an economic security issue that we as a nation need to really look and reflect upon. And it's not just one issue. There's a whole multitude of things that we need to be looking at. So
that's a
I know it's a
great,
long way from facilities and wet labs, but I wanted to bring that up as we get close to the closing.
I think that's a great note to end on. That's all the time we have for audience questions. We had some great ones. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here today and for your expert insights. And thank you to the audience for your great questions. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. And thanks